Welcome to week 4. So we're going to see some important changes happening in the ancient Near East this week. We're going to see technological innovation, and we're going to see some social changes in organization and how these societies function. And now we're moving over east from the Levant and from Anatolia, and we're looking at Mesopotamia. Right? So the area that's Iraq, Syria, and part of Iran. And we're going to look at several different cultures of the pottery Neolithic. And this week we'll talk about how pottery started, possibly the incentive to develop pottery, and some of the earliest pottery in Mesopotamia. So now we're out of the pre-pottery Neolithic. Çatalhöyük was kind of the beginning of the pottery Neolithic in Anatolia. Now we're going to be looking at the pottery Neolithic in Mesopotamia. We're going to be looking at several different quote-unquote cultures. And we'll talk about how archaeologists identify different cultures. You've already read a little bit about that. But because we don't have writing at this period, it really comes from styles of materials, pottery, architecture, things like that. What do these things actually mean? Well, that's one of the things that we'll hopefully discuss this week. That is, if you see pottery start in one area and then it spreads, what exactly is spreading? If you find pottery outside of Mesopotamia, and you find architecture in other areas that looks Mesopotamian, what does that exactly mean? That's a big puzzle for archaeologists. So first we're going to look at the Proto-Hassuna and the Hassuna people. As you're going to read in the readings for this week, all of these names just come from the site where they were first identified, right? So Tellus Hassuna, they found this early pottery, and they called the entire time period, the entire culture, Hassuna culture. Same with Samarra. We're going to be moving south from Hassuna to the Samarran culture. This is a very interesting culture, as we're going to see, because this is some of the earliest irrigation in the ancient Middle East. They moved into an area of Mesopotamia, and we're going to talk about this throughout the semester, where there's very little rainfall, so rain-fed agriculture is virtually impossible. Then we'll go back and talk more about northern Mesopotamia with the Halaf period, and talk about a famous archaeological site that was excavated by Max Mallowan and also Agatha Christie. And then we'll go back down to the very southern part of Mesopotamia to talk about the Ubaid and some of the beginnings of complex societies. So I'm going to give you the visual perspective, right? So the Levant is off of the chart here. This is Iraq, right? Modern-day Iraq and parts of Iran. So Baghdad would be about here. I think I have it correctly. And Dagabia is this Proto-Hassuna site we're going to talk about. And then that develops into the Hassuna culture, the Samarran culture, Halaf culture, and then later on at the end, the Ubaid culture. So you could see that these different cultures grew up in different parts of Mesopotamia. And that's important because different parts of Mesopotamia, rainfall agriculture is possible. In other areas, it is impossible. Okay, so last week, that might have been a little bit of a review for some of you. For some of you, it might have been the first time hearing about this sort of typology of different societies, bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. With each of these societies going from bands all the way up to states, we see an increase in size, increase in complexity, and also an increase in, or a change in subsistence strategy. Right? So one of the things that you're going to read this week is sort of a little bit of a review of these terms, and also a little bit about, it's a useful typology for archaeologists. It's not necessarily accurately reflecting every variation that's out there, and with all typologies, there's problems with it, but it's pretty useful for archaeologists to at least try and see if a society, where a society fits along this spectrum. So let's just review quickly again. Bands are typically called the simplest, and we don't mean simple as in the people are simple. It's just a term indicating not complex. And what we mean there is that it's mostly egalitarian. Hierarchy is not inherited, and there's actually in bands very little hierarchy. It's mostly egalitarian. These are hunter and gatherers, typically 25 to 30 people in a group. Tribes are bigger. These are usually horticultural people who are doing cultivation, maybe not full-fledged farming yet, but they're sedentary. They live in villages of 100 to 200 people. These are typically what we call the big man or big woman societies, where leadership, again, is not inherited and it's not permanent, but different ambitious people can gain more prestige, influence in the society through gift-giving and feasting. But you cross a threshold at some point into complex societies, and chiefdoms and states are complex societies. That means their hierarchy is permanent, fixed, and it's an institution. You have things essentially like classes. Here, prestige, power, wealth is inherited, and it's what we would call a ranked society. So you have different levels of citizens or people within the group, and there's ranking. There's a clear hierarchy. Now, there's lots of variation in the way these chiefdoms can form and the way they, can actually display power. Typically, chiefdoms are agricultural villages or agricultural societies. In a large village, you can have something like 5,000 people, up to maybe 50,000 people. Hawaii, around the time of contact with Europeans, is probably one of the best documented chiefdoms around. And then, as we're going to be talking about probably next week or the week after, you have states. States are really a synonym for what we would call civilization. These are very, very large societies that typically are defined as having cities, having populations in 100,000 to millions of people, where there's even more ranking and even more hierarchy, and the difference between the top and the bottom is even greater. We like to use these terms to describe these kinds of societies. So complex societies, again, are societies where the hierarchy is fixed and permanent. Social stratification is a way of describing the difference in economic power or wealth between the very top and the very bottom. So if there's a lot of difference between the very top and very bottom, you would say there was a high degree of social stratification. You could say accurately that the United States has higher degrees of social stratification than many European countries, right? Take Scandinavian countries like Norway, Sweden, Denmark. There's more, I would say even Germany. There's, not a Scandinavian country, but there's more social stratification in the United States than in those countries. I forget exactly the statistic, but it's something like, the top 1% of earners in the United States own something like 40% of all the wealth. I forget. It's something around that. Political centralization is talking about a similar thing, difference between the very top and the very bottom, but it's focused on power and decision making. So who has the power? When you're talking about centralizing, you're talking about held in the hands of fewer people. So high degrees of political centralization means that there are fewer people with more power making more of the decisions in the society. Saying there's less political centralization means power is more diffuse and held in the hands of more and more people. As we're going to see with a lot of these societies, complex societies, a lot of archaeologists look at ideology as a potential source of power. We saw last week that some of the bases of power in complex societies were economic, military or power from force, but also ideological, which is typically can take the form of religious ideas. So ideology is comprised of worldview and belief systems. And what we see in different parts of the world is that leaders can use the belief systems of the culture to influence people and influence their decision making. Right? And we see this obviously in our society as well. If people believe a certain thing, you can easily use dog whistle words, code words, or not so coded language to get them to do stuff. This debate about this, but could you have chiefdoms without agriculture? There are some examples of chiefdoms that are based on aquatic marine resources. But you don't really have any examples of state societies without agriculture. So only agriculture can support these scale societies, because these state societies function on surplus food. There has to be a surplus to support craft specialists and other kinds of specialists within the society. Okay, this is also kind of hard within archaeology, but how do you tell if the society you're excavating is actually a chiefdom or if it's just a very big tribe? This can be difficult, but there are usually things you can look for, and Hawaii is a good example. We saw some of the elements of a chiefdom in Hawaii. So we can look for some of those things archaeologically, and that might tell us that the society that we're examining is in fact a chiefdom. So typically a two-settlement hierarchy. That is, there's differences in sizes of sites. In a big man society or a tribe, all the sites would be approximately the same size. But in the chiefdom, you'd have a larger site where the chief lived. This is also where some of those religious or ritual structures would be. Maybe the chief's house. It would be a larger site and would be surrounded by smaller agricultural villages. What about in those larger villages? Again, monumental architecture. The ability to call up people and have them build large monuments is very important. We saw how Göbekli Tepe kind of puts a wrench in this idea a little bit, because there you have monuments without hierarchy and without chiefdoms. And before that time, people thought that monumental architecture was really only possible in large societies where there was some kind of leadership. But certainly once you have leadership, you can build things that are even bigger than the things at Göbekli Tepe. And this is something that we see in many societies, but typically the monuments in early societies have a religious function, and that's not too surprising. Religion's a very powerful force, and it's a very powerful motivator. So people would be motivated to build a monument if it was going to essentially serve the entire community. It may also be serving the leaders as well, but the people in general would more likely to build a house for their god than they would to build a house for their chief. Okay, craft specialization is also important. You need surplus. You need people with free time, and you also, prestige goods are things that are desired by elites, and usually craft specialists who make prestige goods are supported by elites. So really finely crafted crafts can be an indication of a more complex society. Graves and burial data. If you have a few people who have a lot of wealth compared to the majority of the population, then that would be a good indication that you have inherited wealth and inherited rank. Also, as we're going to talk about, child burials with wealth are typically a good indication of rank, because what that indicates is what we would call ascribed status, not a chief status. A chief status is wealth you can accumulate during your lifetime. But a young child, let's say 9 years old, being buried with gold and silver, obviously that child didn't earn it during its lifetime. It inherited it. That means it was a scribe status. It was a status they were born into. And it shows that wealth and also prestige were passed down from one generation to another, were inherited. Also, the kinds of artifacts and where they're distributed. So, are there a few houses that have higher quality artifacts, rare trade goods that are not present in that area as compared to the majority of the population? If that's true, then maybe you're beginning to look at a complex society or the beginnings of a chiefdom. Okay, now we're going to look at pottery. The earliest pottery in Mesopotamia, how it may have originated, and some of the ways that archaeologists can try and determine why it was invented in the first place.